Good evening. Welcome everyone to our 7th lesson in our study on Acts to the ends of the earth. This is our study of the second half of Acts, and right now we're in the middle of the second missionary journey. The dog Squeaky. Squeaky toy has been removed from the dog. Okay, second missionary journey. So someone tell us what happened, in the story, just where we left off after last week. So we're starting in, because I neglected to send you your readings. I'm so sorry. I sent them to Linda and they went out in her ministry newsletter, and then I forgot to send them to this group. So we are starting at Acts 18:1, the very beginning of chapter 18. So what happened last week would be all in 17.
Yeah, Paul went off to the different churches in the different cities in last week's lesson, and sometimes they did not agree with him too heavily.
Right? And that's kind of a summary that we could say about every week, right? He goes to the cities, to the churches, he has problems there. So last week he was in Thessalonica. He gets kicked out, he's run out of town. Yes, I like that motioning. He's in Thessalonica. We saw there that they were, they said he's been turning the world upside down. And we see that the message of Jesus was quite radical and the effects were very far reaching. It was a major life shift for everyone involved. And so this was something that was big. And we also see that the Jews are obviously from city to city, the grapevine is alive, right? They are keeping in contact with each other. The word is spreading about this new strange message. And it's big enough that the word goes before him in some ways, right? So he kicked out of there. He goes to Berea. What do we notice about the Bereans?
They studied the scriptures and they were more solid, I guess, they were better Jews.
More noble of character. Yeah, they got a commendation for their willingness to look through the scriptures to see that Jesus was the Christ. And these were the Hebrew scriptures, right? So they're studying the Old Testament to see that Jesus was the Christ. So another little piece that tells us that the early church believed that the Old Testament did point to Jesus and was really about Jesus in some way. Right. And then he went on to Athens, and we spend the most time there because he had a lot to say to the Athenians, and he gave a long sermon that sort of represents his answer to all of the philosophical traditions there. So you may remember we talked about the Epicureans and the Stoics, the Platonists, and just the general pagans. And for every piece of that, he had a piece of good news for them. You may have thought that the gods were just a long way away, but no, there's one God who's right here. You may have thought that there was just an impersonal force in the pantheistic force in the world, but no, there's a personal God who's reaching out to you. You may think that you don't have enough information to know about God, and maybe you didn't, but now you do. And so there's something within each of these ideas that speaks to us now and has something to say to our generation and our culture. So now, he does Athens, and then he has a couple of converts, a couple of important converts, but not many. It's not a super big church that forms in Athens. And he leaves and he heads on to Corinth. So let's read Acts 18:1 through 9.
I'll read it. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." Oh, I wasn't supposed to read 10. I'm sorry.
That's good. That's fine. So he's now in Corinth. So this is the southern part of Macedonia. There's like a peninsula that comes down to this tiny little isthmus, and then spreads out again. And Corinth is just at that isthmus. And over the years, several Roman rulers had tried to build a canal there. Julius Caesar tried, and Caligula tried, and after Paul's time, Nero tried, but they all failed to build this canal. It was a difficult engineering project, and it wasn't actually completed until modern times. So everything went through Corinth. That was a place where all the travel sort of converged. Lots of trade, lots of travelers, a very cosmopolitan city. And you may have heard that it was known for all kinds of vice, right? It was known for, you could drink and carouse and get up to trouble in Corinth, right? It was also a Roman colony. And like several of the Roman colonies we talked about, they were very proud of the fact, and they prided themselves on being more Roman than Rome. And even with the time of Paul, there was a new temple built for the imperial cult, a temple to Caesar that was built. So it was, just a little higher than all the other temples of the city, so that it was like, all the gods look up to the god of Caesar, kind of a idea in the city. So who does Paul meet there? And what can we tell about them?
Well, he met Priscilla and Aquila, who had come from Rome, and they'd been forced out because they were, all Jews were forced to leave Rome. Is it all Jews?
Yes, that's how it's written. Yeah. So these were Jews, and also, like, what is their status as far as Jesus?
They're believers.
Yeah, these are believers in Jesus. These are Jewish Christians. So this would have been, right along the lines of what Paul is, right? And they were, it says, Aquila was originally a resident of Pontus. That's a different area. So he was, I think I'm remembering that is north of like Troas. So like on the other side, the mainland side from the Aegean Sea, and up there a little bit north. Doesn't matter. Not from Rome, but they were in Rome and they were forced to leave. So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, what do we know about a church in Rome? Have we read anything in Acts about a church in Rome?
I can't remember. You may have to help me
There's
with this
nothing.
one.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing. Go ahead, Erin. We have nothing that says there was even a church in Rome. Luke has not mentioned sending anyone to Rome or anyone, preaching there. And yet there is apparently a large enough body there that even, and this is the other interesting part, this issue that they were expelled over. So we have some other sources that talk about how Claudius expelled the Jews because of riots led by Chrestus. Okay, and so we're going, well, who's Chrestus that he's leading a riot? And what the speculation is that he has misunderstood the name Christ, and that these are little uproars between Jewish believers and Jewish non-believers over Jesus Christ, right? Over who is the Christ, right? So that there's enough of a church that they're having battles with the Jews, and this keeps happening until Claudius has enough of it and says, you have to get out of Rome. We have a different source that tells it a little differently. It says that he couldn't expel them, but he did forbid them from meeting, and as a result, they all left, meaning they would have been effectively expelled. So it's sort of an interesting sort of pair of pieces of information they add together to, there was a significant church in Rome, one that caused a significant disruption in the Jewish community there. And it seems that Priscilla and Aquila left because of this issue, right? Questions or comments on that? We know one more thing about them. What's the other thing we know about them?
They're tent builders.
Yeah. And we learn here that this is the same trade skill as Paul. So even rabbis were taught a trade, and Paul probably practiced tent making at one time in Tarsus, where he was from, and probably, picked it up here. And then at this point, he mentions it repeatedly, especially in his letters back to the Corinthians, that he worked to pay his own way. So it seems that he, coming into Corinth, in these other places, it doesn't mention him working to pay his own way. But who did he not have with him yet?
Silas and Timothy.
Yeah, so remember when he was in Berea, the Bereans were noble, but the Jews from Thessalonica came on over, even though it was a place that was hard to access, and stirred up trouble. And the Bereans, the brothers there, rushed Paul off and ended up taking him all the way to Athens with instructions that Silas and Timothy join him as soon as possible. So all this time, he's been waiting for Silas and Timothy, and in their absence, he has found Priscilla and Aquila. So this had to have been, a really good thing for him. And this relationship, we see as we follow through that it had to have been a very important relationship to him. He had this partnership for friendship and support. So when Silas and Timothy arrive, what does that big change does that allow Paul to make? Verse 5.
He goes into full-time ministry.
Yeah, because of their support, he's able to switch to exclusively preaching, which he didn't feel that he could do before. We get some insight from this from the letters to the Corinthians. I mentioned this comes up in 1 Corinthians 9. He talks about this quite, a bit. And he says that he knows he had a right to accept financial support from them, but he decided not to, making a judgment that it could hinder the gospel there. So it may be that the city there was so worldly that it was he just felt like it would make him too indebted to them. He says in 1 Corinthians 9:12, nevertheless, we did not use this right, the right to financial support, but we endured all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. And then he talks later about making sure he may offer the gospel without charge. That's 9:18. So before Silas and Timothy are there, he really felt like this is a community where I cannot afford to take money. I have to support myself. Thoughts on that? It's kind of interesting.
Well, it sort of plays into the people that were healing people for money later on, as we read. I think maybe he thought it made him look too much like them.
Yeah, there were always, just like here, there's always someone who's got a new thing to say and they would like a donation, right? I mean, this happens then and it happens now. And so Paul wants to make sure he's not just perceived as just needing a donation. Okay, so he's back preaching. He's trying to make this Jewish community understand, it says, to persuade them, reasoned in the synagogue, that same word that for dialogue, that's back and forth reasoning, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So it's this idea like Jesus is the culmination of everything you've been waiting for, everything God has been doing, that has happened in Jesus. And tensions seem to get higher and higher until the Jews that don't believe break out against him. What does your translation say that the Jews do in verse 6?
Became abusive.
Okay, I have became abusive in one of the ones I use sometimes too, but any others?
Mine says they opposed and reviled him.
Reviled? Oh, interesting. Any different ones? So the NASB, which is what I always use for word study because because of the way they try to keep more literal translation, has the exact word that, it's the word blasphemeo, it's blasphemed. The Jews opposed him or resisted him and blasphemed. So it isn't just that they became like insulting or they were really mad at him. This word blasphemed, is our clue, right? That remember when Jesus was accused of being in league with Beelzebub, he cast out demons by the prince of demons. Jesus called that blasphemy. So it's likely that they were doing something like that. Like if you say all this about Jesus, if you say he did these things, that can't be from God. That must be from Satan. So they got so far along that they called good evil and evil good. And so Paul, then, we've said tensions are running high, right? He's also upset. And he effectively says to them, if you don't want the culmination of everything God has been doing for you and through you for all these generations, fine. And he leaves, right? But where does he go?
Next door to the Gentiles.
Right, to the Gentiles, but next door, right? It's the same thing. It's this pattern that he's done over and over. Even where he's done with the Jews, he does not really give up on them. He doesn't really abandon them or leave them. And he doesn't close the door to anyone who wants to believe, because who believes next?
Ruler of the synagogue.
Yeah, Crispus it says he's the synagogue ruler. And so he comes to believe, he and his whole household believe and are baptized, right? And there Paul is next door. And it seems that Titus Justus is a believer and wealthy enough to have this house to offer. And so Paul is still preaching from there, a little bit in your face, right? That he's right next door, but he's still preaching there. And what's happening as he's preaching there? Into verse 8.
Yeah, many of the Corinthians heard him and believed and were baptized.
Yeah. So if it wasn't in their face enough before, now they've got the Gentiles streaming in, being baptized and effectively joining without becoming Jews, right? So if tensions were high, now they're higher. How do we think Paul feels about this situation?
I'm sure he's excited, but I'm sure the Jews feel like he's kind of putting his thumb in there.
Yeah, I can see that. Notice what the word he gets in this vision in verse 9 is. What's the first thing is said?
Not be afraid.
Do not be afraid.
Do not be afraid. So how do we think he was feeling?
Afraid.
I think so, right? Like whenever the angel comes and says, do not be afraid, it's because the person's fallen down with terror, right? So, you know, this do not be afraid, I think speaks to where Paul is. He must have been really in a rough spot. We get later an idea that he had made a vow at some point because he gets his hair cut off to fulfill the vow. And we wonder, is this the time that he made that vow? Because this was a time where things were feeling very dicey in the community there. How was the synagogue? What were relationships like in the synagogue community? If some of them are abusive or blaspheming, and some of them are coming over to believe, and it's usually a very tight-knit community, which it would have been, right? Because Jews, they stick to themselves, right? They stick to their community. They don't eat with Gentiles. They don't do any of the things that Gentiles do, where they go to the temples and the festivals and so it was a tight-knit community. And some of them are to the point of blasphemy, and some of them are to the point of being baptized. So how was that community?
They were pretty divided.
Yeah, they would have had to be substantially divided. And I think Paul was really feeling it. And so he gets this word, do not be afraid. We get several little echoes of Old Testament stories just in this little word from God, okay? He says, keep on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you. This is, do not be afraid is the word that, Joshua got as he's heading into the promised land. I am with you. That shows up in the Psalms, as David is, writing about God and God's word to him. And then he says, I have many people in this city. I think this reminds us of Elijah, the great prophet. He had a time where he had a big showdown with the prophets of Baal, and he won. But then he was exhausted and depleted, and he ran and he said, I'm the only one left. There's no one. And God came to him and he said, no, I have many people. I have this many number of people who haven't bowed a knee to Baal. I have, and so I think, these little phrases, they really call out the Old Testament story. And in this word, we get a lot of reassurance from God. Like, I have been there the whole history. This is part of my history. This is part of what I'm doing, and I'm still here. So a really big, boost for Paul and help when he must have been in a dark time. Thoughts or ideas on that?
An angel or is it the Lord? Because my version says the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. So I just didn't know. Yeah, like so many other times it's an angel appeared, but in this particular one, it felt like it was direct.
It does feel like that. It does say the Lord spoke to Paul. Sometimes he in other places he talks about being taken up in a vision to the third heaven, and so we want all the details. What are all? Could you please catalog all your visions and tell us all about all of them? But, yeah. What else?
Something I was confused about here too, and I guess it's just kind of a fine line. Is it Jesus that's the vision, or is it God? I mean, I realize that they're both.
Yeah,
I was thinking the same thing.
It's the way that the Hebrew would do Lord, when you see it in your Bible in the all caps, you know, it's using the name, like the writing is the consonants are the letters for Yahweh. And so it's like the God, right? It's the I am. But the Jews would pronounce that as the word for Lord. They wouldn't say Yahweh out loud. And so they would say the word Lord. And so that's why it's always translated like Lord in all caps. It's like the special Lord, right? Well, when you get to the Greek, they just use the Greek word for Lord. It's the same word. It's kurios. It's the same word that you would use for like a master, you know, a noble, you know, kind of title. And so we get a sort of, it happens repeatedly where they kind of make a play on using an Old Testament reference to that says, that would literally have said Yahweh, and they put the word Lord in there and talk about the Lord as Jesus. And so, you know, we can't really tell which it is, but the way that has the pattern of usage sort of points to both, and is, I think, an intentional way of pointing to Jesus and saying Jesus is God when they talk about Jesus as Lord. I don't know if was that confusing.
No, in what is this? The new NIV. You know, where Jesus speaks, it's all in red, and it is in red here.
Yeah, that's a translator's choice, but I like it. I think it's a good choice.
Yeah.
You know, the original doesn't tell us, you know, is that God the Father? Is that Jesus the Son? And yet, I think, you know, yeah, that's nice.
I also think the line of, I just thought of Moses as well when he says, go on speaking and don't be silent. That was just another person I felt like it was alluding to.
Yes, I agree. Great point. Yeah. And the, you know, Paul never seems to us to be on the verge of being silent, but, you know, it must have been, for him to need this reassurance, he must have been in a hard place, right? Because he always seems to want to speak. Yeah. And it's interesting. It's like, no one is going to attack you and harm you. Really? Because people attacked him and harmed him in every other city. Right? This is like, he leaves beaten and battered over and over and over again. And maybe he's just getting a little bruised and broken on from this pattern. So yeah, God says, nope, I have a plan. So how long does he stay?
A year and a half.
A year and a half. Yeah. So far, this is the longest that we know of. You know, we don't have this whole story, right? Luke gives us a slice of the story, just like we don't have the part in Rome, you know, to know how that church started. We don't know all the times that Paul stayed in all places, but quite a long time. And what is he doing? Verse 11.
Teaching the word.
Yeah, he is having to start from scratch with all these Gentiles, right? So we see when he writes to the Corinthians, they do not really have a clue how things are supposed to be, right? Like they have a lot of problems. And so it's, you know, they just don't have the foundation in the understanding of God and of the story of the people of God and God's revelation over time. Like they don't know this stuff. He's having to teach all of that. So the whole story of like, there's a creator. He's actually a person who creates everything. It's not born out of a battle between gods. Like he's having to start from the beginning and build up everything. The whole word of God is something that he's having to try to communicate. And we know the Corinthians get a lot of things wrong. And he writes back to them and teaches more. And he's saying, we are children of Abraham. So, you know, they're not literally children of Abraham by birth, and yet he's narrating them into this full story of the people of God over the scriptures. And so he's doing that this whole time. Let's read verses 12 through 17. Would someone pick that up?
But when Gallio was...
Oh, go ahead.
But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized on Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this.
Okay. So what happens here?
Whoa.
No harm came to Paul.
Right. As promised.
It was passed right on. Is this the same city? Because is this a different city, or is it a different synagogue? What's going on? Because it's a different ruler of the synagogue.
Great point. Yeah. What has happened with the synagogue ruler?
Did they fire him?
I think so. I think Crispus, when he believed in Jesus and was baptized and joined Paul's movement, this Jesus movement, I think he lost his position as the synagogue ruler. Or, you know, it may have been some time. He was there for a year and a half, but somehow there's now a different synagogue ruler. I think that points to the division in the synagogue that we see. Yeah.
Which then makes it really odd that they beat him, because if Crispus left because he had joined the Jesus movement, and this guy had come in and was not part of that movement, and they chose to beat him, it's kind of like they turned on themselves. And...
I think what's happening here is when it says they all, it's a little vague, but I think what's happening here is that this is the onlookers, and that's what's come out of it is they decide he's brought a false charge, and over bringing a false charge, the sort of otherwise uninterested bystanders have a chance to attack the group that he leads, which is the Jews. And there's always a little bit of anti-Jewish sentiment in all of these cities because the Jews were so separate and because they didn't worship the gods. And if they have brought a false charge, the general people, not necessarily the other Jews from that party or the Christians or, you know, may have taken it out on Sosthenes as the leader of that group. Yeah. That seems to be like the best guess, because it is a little bit, it doesn't detail that out totally. This event can be dated pretty accurately, which is always kind of neat to see. Gallio was a leader he had a different position in a different region, and he was brought to Achaia. Achaia is the region that the city Corinth is in. So he is there in Achaia, in, you know, Corinth as the like state capital, you know, is how we would see it. And this, we have inscriptions saying when this was. So this event had to have happened around 51, 52 AD. And it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that allows us to like go backward and forward and figure out a little bit of Paul's timeline and kind of match those things together. And what did the Jews accuse Paul of?
Of persuading people to worship God contrary to the law.
Contrary to the law, right. And what does Gallio say about it?
Basically says if it were a matter of crime, vicious crime, or doing something wrong, I could accept your complaint, but it's all about words and names and your own law. So I don't really care.
Okay, your own law. So he says this thing between the Jews and the Christians is all a matter of Jewish law, right? So legally, this is putting the Christian group under the umbrella of the Jewish people. Well, why is that really good for Christians?
Because the Jewish faith was already established and accepted, had exceptions made for it to stay in all of the Roman Empire.
Yes, yeah, this is a significant protection for the Christians. Now, his Gallio's ruling would not be in force. It wouldn't be effective in other regions, right? He's just ruler of this area. But for this area, this is a big kind of protection for the Christians. To say that they are basically a subset of Judaism is very good for them. That they would be then under the exception where they didn't have to worship Caesar. Just as the Jews had that exception, they would then be able to have that exception. And so this is really helpful. And then Paul doesn't even get attacked. So great result out of this trial, except for poor Sosthenes. Other questions or comments on this trial?
I thought it was interesting that Paul didn't even have to say anything to protect himself. And then just one other quick note in my notes, it says that after this, there were many other, I'm going to call them court hearings, where the same sentiment was said, where it kind of puts the Christians under the Jewish law, and therefore they have the same protections within the law.
Where are you seeing that? Like in your notes?
Hang on, I'll find it.
This does become something that is good for the Christians, and it is a helpful thing where it happens.
It says right here in the notes, 1814, Gallio's judgment of the Jewish accusation against the Christians concern only matters of their own religion, established the important legal precedent that the Christians were innocent of transgressing Roman law when merely teaching and following Christian doctrine. A similar judgment comes later in 2519.
Okay. So it's referring us, pretty far forward in the story. Thank you. That's interesting. So this is like, they don't tell us where in the year and a half this happened, right? This is just an incident that happens at some point. And so, over this time, he's staying on, as it says in verse 18, for some time. Okay. Then let's look at those verses, 18 through 23, we'll take a look at. Then he left the brothers, and where is he going? Verse 18.
Syria.
Syria, what's in Syria?
Priscilla and Aquila are there.
So Priscilla and Aquila are going to end up, they're with him in Corinth, and they're going to end up staying at his next stop. But remember let's look at the map a little bit.
Is it the big Antioch?
The big Antioch, right. So Syria is where his home church is, his commissioning church. It's where he started from and goes in between these journeys. Let's share this. Okay. So I've got my little map up, and you can see right here is Corinth, and it's right. See the isthmus that we've been talking about. Up here is Thessalonica, Berea, and then Philippi way back up here. So chapter 16, chapter 17, and then we're down in chapter 18. He set sail for Syria. Well, this is Syria, right? Here's where Antioch is in the region of Syria. So this is a significant sea journey. And we don't know if this is a resupply, but the initial journey, he set sail for Syria. We'll we'll come back to Centria, which is, I may have to zoom in for that. See where it is right here? It's kind of the port stop, and then they stop in Ephesus. So they just do this little jog right across the Aegean Sea before they do the longer route to get all the way to Syria. Questions on the map before I take it away? This is the same map I have sent you before, so you have this in email. Okay, so he's headed home, right? He's got his nose pointed towards home. He's headed back to his home church, the church that commissioned him. We get this little note that before he sailed, he had his hair cut off because of a vow. And this was a common part of Jewish piety, a common practice to take a vow. It's kind of like a mini version of what a Nazarite might do, where they grow their hair their whole life. Like the person would grow their hair for a time and then cut it at the completion of the vow. This may have been an indication of Paul making some special sorts of, piety and practice during this time in Corinth. So he has his hair cut off because of a vow, and then they stop in Ephesus, resupply, switch ships, whatever the reason. And it seems that they wanted him what? What did they want him to do? Verse 20.
Stay longer.
Stay longer. Paul, like, when have you ever heard Paul say, no, I'm not going to preach anymore here? It's interesting, right? What does he do instead? He doesn't stay longer.
He says he'll return if God wills it.
Yeah, and he leads people there. Who does he lead there?
He leaves Priscilla and Aquila, but did he also leave Timothy and the other one?
Silas? I don't think so. I think
did they stay far behind? Or they stayed with him?
I think they stayed with him. It doesn't say. Just like we need a catalog of all of the visions, we need a catalog of who was where at all times. But it doesn't say that they stay behind. I can't remember if later we have an indication of something like that. We'll be on the lookout for that. Is that me? I'm going to do a mute just in case. Okay. So, yeah, he leaves Priscilla and Aquila there. And, why them? Why would they be the ones to leave behind?
Maybe to lead the church there that's established.
Yeah, some leadership, right? Because Paul doesn't get to stay very long, and they are established, they are stable, they are mature. They're this team, this couple that he trusts, right? I think this is a really meaningful partnership for him that he can lead them there. And so they're able to continue what Paul is not able to continue right then. Why do you think Paul is headed out? Like, why does he leave? It doesn't say. We have to speculate a little bit.
Is he going back through to check on the places he first went to?
I think there's, he doesn't go the overland route to go back through those churches if he's sailing. But yes, I think he's wanting to check in at Antioch. I think that he's headed home, and he's reluctant to delay, his trip anymore. He stayed so long in Corinth. He's been gone all the time that he was in the other cities, plus this year and a half in Corinth. And I think he's really eager to get back to Antioch, whether to check on them or to get some encouragement, some refuel, some rest and recharge with them. Like when that's his home church, I think he has a real drive to get back there and spend some time there. So he does. We see in verse 23, 22 and 23, he goes to Antioch and he spends some time in Antioch. Well, Luke glosses it over, right? But there's a time period that passes there. And then he's going to set off again. He's back ready to check on his churches again in verse 23. And he sets off, he travels from place to place through Galatia. So now it's the overland route, like through Galatia and Phrygia, all of those first cities that we talked about in the first missionary journey, Derbe, Lystra, and he's strengthening the churches. Let's look at the end of chapter 18, starting in verse 24. While Paul's been in Antioch, what's been happening in Ephesus?
Apollo was there teaching the John's baptism and teaching that Jesus was coming.
Yeah, this is so interesting, isn't it? Like this person, Apollos, has somehow recognized Jesus from the scriptures, even though he hasn't known about Jesus, right? The very thing that they've been saying is that, like, actually you can see what the Messiah will be like if you read the scriptures in this way. That's been a surprise to everyone. Apollos has been apparently reading the scriptures in that way just from knowing the baptism of John. What do we know about Apollos?
He's from Alexandria.
Okay, so Alexandria is this
learned.
Learned, yeah. Those fit together, don't they? Alexandria is a great center of learning. This is a big North African city. Think like Alexandrian library. This is where there's a strong Jewish scholarly presence there. This is where the Septuagint, the Old Testament translated into Greek, was done in the years before Christ. And so this is a city where you expect the smart people to be doing smart things, and Apollos appears to be one of those people. And he seems to be really good at debating, right, and teaching. And so Prisca and Aquila, you may have Priscilla and you may have Prisca. The Priscilla is a diminutive of Prisca, so it would be like Anne and Annie. So you sometimes get each. Prisca and people say each, so you'll hear them both. They teach him about Jesus, and he had to have been so delighted to find out that this thing that he believes so fervently, just based on study, is real in the flesh and has happened. So what does he want to do once he gets the training, the teaching from Prisca and Aquila? What does he want to do?
He wants to go to the Corinthian region.
Right, back to Achaia, right? So that would be just right back across the Aegean Sea, right? He wants to go over there, and they say, yes, do it. And he seems to be helping the church with his vigorous debate there. So that has all happened while Paul is in away, and then Paul is going to arrive back in Ephesus after Apollos has already departed. So they're like missing each other, and yet we see that God is really providing people to help in all these places, right? What stuck out at you for tonight's lesson? What spoke to you?
I love seeing that line of the Lord speaking to Paul and just being reminded of all of those Old Testament fragments and stories that Paul is continuing in the line of. I think I wouldn't have thought that if you hadn't pointed out that those are all things that have been said to other people throughout the Jewish story. But even though they're all really familiar words, but I like seeing that Paul is just continuing in this whole grander story.
Yeah, and I think that would have been really meaningful to Paul as well. Yeah.
I like how women keep being a part of everything. Does that make sense? Like
Priscilla, and it in my study Bible, it mentions that her name is mentioned first as maybe in order of prominence. Like maybe I appreciate that we have Lydia and we have Priscilla, and there's this acceptance and leadership amongst it.
Yeah, I mean, scholars that sometimes there's two reasons that they've noticed repeatedly that Priscilla's name is mentioned first most often, and they think either she was of higher social status, she had social prominence, or she may have been a more prominent leader in the church. And we have women in the church who are mentioned as fellow workers, one of the titles Paul uses, or deacon or prophet. And so she seems to be in that category of women. We know Lydia was a host and a leader. And yes, great point that Paul seems to be very happy to work with them, right? And happy to trust them and entrust them with ministry in his absence. And they are able to, Apollos seems to be quite an intellectual force, and yet they're able to teach him something he didn't know. And so it's good. It's a good service that we see an offering from these women. I just think about the partnership through all this. God has put Priscilla and Aquila in Paul's path, and that relationship must have meant so much to him, that they be tent makers, right? Like that, and that may have been how he found them, that they were tent makers. Have you ever gone somewhere and you're kind of on your own, and that's fine, but when you find your people, oh, it's such a feeling of support and help and confidence and rest in finding your people. I think Paul really found his people in Priscilla and Aquila. And then just the idea that as he's going one direction, Apollos is coming in, he's going the other direction. Like, God is doing.
Does it kind of mirror Jesus and John, right? Like he says John there, and then, and John was like, I'm just making the way. And so it's kind of two paths are now kind of converging. Is interesting.
Orchestrated. Orchestrated.
Yeah. And then kind of it feels like the old, going back to, my letters are in red as well, that, the Lord spoke to him. But then that the proconsuls basically like, this is yours. Like so many times you heard that with Jesus, right? Like Pontius Pilate didn't want to make that decision. It was a lot like, no, it's you, don't force me. But there's a lot of,
That's interesting. That sort of parallel was something that people noticed in the Tuesday class as well. Like this reminds us of Pilate, where he's like, isn't this your own thing? Don't ask me to judge this.
Yeah, like don't make me make this choice. This is you. And it feels like we've had that, God speaking, and it's lots of
those echoes of the same story of Jesus.
There you go. That's the word. Echoes.
Yeah. Well, and I think those are intentional because, when Jesus's disciples walk in his way, their lives look like his. Those same things happen. Well, that was everything I have for tonight. I was about to say I had you read to halfway through 19, but I didn't because I forgot to send that out. I'm so sorry. Next week, we are going to try to do all of chapter 19, and I'm going to try to get to the end of the third missionary journey in, I think it's 2038. Yes, 2038. So I will try to remember to send that to you. But we'll try to do that third missionary journey and catch ourselves back up. Thank you, everyone.